Welcome back. The term constitutional convention is something we may have learned back in our history books, but there is a push now to have a modern day constitutional convention. The question is why? Let's bring in Grace Panetta from Insider. She's a senior politics reporter with more on this. The piece came out yesterday. It caught on like wildfire, but I think we got to get down to this, Grace. What is a constitutional convention?
Yeah, so what many of us may not know is that the Constitution provides two ways to amend it. Either Congress can pass an amendment, which is how all of the amendments to the Constitution we have now were added, or the lesser known and never before accomplished route is for 2/3 of the states to call a convention to propose amendments and change or even upend the entire Constitution.
So this is not something done willy-nilly, obviously not something that we've seen it on the state level, various places across the years. But what is behind the latest push here?
The latest push is really by conservative activists who are bankrolled by some very, very powerful conservative interests, groups connected to the Kochs, the Mercers, big name GOP donors and power players who are pushing for a new constitutional convention that would further rein in the power of the federal government, as has been the conservative project for much of the last half century.
There have been, you mentioned some of the big names bankrolling it, but fronting some of these efforts, and somebody who went on the record as being in favor of this push was former Pennsylvania Senator Rick Santorum, a man who served 12 years in the Senate. He was in the Congress for a number of years as well. Somebody who knows the ins and outs of Washington, even though he sort of tried to fashion himself as a bit of an outsider these days. What's his motivation here?
It's really fascinating learning all the different figures and characters involved in this movement. Some familiar names like Rick Santorum. He is a senior advisor now to Convention of States, which is the major conservative group, well-funded, that has the most momentum in trying to make this happen. And in our story, we featured audio we got of inside last winter's summit of the American Legislative Exchange Council, a major conservative group where Santorum was really passionately pitching this convention to lawmakers, explaining it as their moral duty as the founders intended.
When you look at, you mentioned the number of states that would have to sign on to this idea. Where does that count stand? There are states that have gone on the record so far as saying that they'd be in favor of this?
Yes, and the math is a little tricky because there have been many different efforts to call a convention, but it has to be sort of under a single topic, a single resolution, 34 states. So the group that now has the most momentum, Convention of States, they have 19. So they need 15 more, and whether or not they get there is going to be highly dependent on the outcome of this year's midterm elections and state elections.
Is this something that we see groups putting out as a motivating factor in trying to win these statewide elections? Because look, we know that when it comes to seats on the judiciary, Republicans have been very good at telling their supporters, you're not just voting for legislators, you're voting to shape this future. It's not something we've heard a lot about. Is this something maybe we'll hear more about depending on how the midterms turn out?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, a really interesting comparison. You know, Convention of States leader Mark Meckler at this ALEC meeting, he explicitly said, our movement is the only thing that will get people, this grassroots, engaged. He has a Tea Party background, so he's very, very familiar with the grassroots engagement side of it. And he absolutely wants to make it a campaign issue. He likened this movement to everyday Americans getting their hands around the throat of the government. So their goal is to absolutely further make this a motivating, energizing issue like so many other state power-related issues have been for conservatives.
There has been talk over the years about the role of the Constitution in shaping law, and you have Republicans who have an originalist comprehension of the document. You have progressives who seem to believe it's a living, breathing document that evolves over time here. So when you look at this from the perspective of somebody who believes that the founding fathers, their vision needs to be upheld, do you believe that some people out there think that there is how do you change a document that you stick so heavily to right now?
Yeah, then you bring up a really, really important tension in this movement, within the conservative movement. The reason why this hasn't gained more traction and the reason why groups like Convention of States have had such a hard time getting this through even Republican legislators is because a lot of conservatives and right-wing groups are like, wait a minute, we don't want to change the document. We don't want to risk our gun rights or open the door to anything crazy. And that's been, I think, really critical to why this movement has kind of struggled and why they do have an uphill battle.
Well, we're going to see what happens here. Obviously, it's fascinating. Pushed out a link to the piece just because I think it is something that has not been on our radar, maybe not just on our end of the media, but for a lot of voters out there. And you're right, these midterms, especially there's one in Arizona coming up very soon tomorrow. They play a major role in this, so we'll see how it shakes out. Grace Panetta, thank you so much for joining me. It's good to see you, and we appreciate you joining us here on The Final Five.
Thank you for having me, Jim.
And The Final Five is back right after this.